appreciate everyone joining on not everyone's on, it's not 8 o'clock Eastern for everyone, but on a Wednesday evening to talk about really a deep dive into the FAFSA. And full transparency, I'm going to admit that I think everyone has words that they may mispronounce from time to time. Unfortunately, being in the financial planning industry, one of those words for me is the FAFSA. So if I say FAFSA instead of FAFSA, I apologize in advance. Just one of those words. But I'm excited for this topic. I went through this process when I was a high school and college student, and I also went through this process. My sister is much younger, so I helped her go through this process more recently, and we get a bunch of questions from parents on this topic. So I'm excited to dive into it. As we kind of progress throughout today, I guess a little bit of background before we jump into this. My name is Brian Walsh, and I lead the financial planning team here at SoFi. I am a certified financial planner, and really with the planning team, I get to see what our members are asking our planners about. In this time of year, October 1st and after tends to be the time where we get questions about college planning, financial aid, FAFSA, things like that. Honestly, I'm more of a kind of a financial planning nerd. So I love all things personal finance. And as we go through this topic, if you have questions related to FAFSA or other topics related to finances, please toss them in there and we'll get to them towards the end. I mentioned that I was a CFP and I lead the planning team. Just need to make sure that I clarify, nothing I talk about today should be looked at as financial advice. Think about this more as high-level education, guidance, things along those lines. Especially as we start talking about the FAFSA, there's some intricacies related to the FAFSA, where maybe if you have corner cases or fringe cases or things like that, it can really get into the weeds. As we kind of talk through the session, as we break down the components and dive deeply into the FAFSA, one of the sections I'll kind of hit on some resources and places that you can turn to. I think that's especially important if you have, basic questions or more complicated situations, leveraging different experts throughout this experience. And honestly, the financial aid office of the school of your choice or schools that you're considering can be absolutely fantastic resources. So you could turn to those places as well. So really today, what we're looking at doing is, we're going to focus on the FAFSA. We'll talk a little bit to put it in context related to just a broad look at financial aid, different types of financial aid, how it works, how those sources of financial aid come into play. To kind of set the groundwork for the FAFSA. And then we're going to spend a majority of the time talking about the FAFSA, different components of it, different considerations, processes, things like that to be aware of as you're kind of going through this process. And then how that really kind of connects and, the FAFSA and how that connects to financial aid. And then we'll close it out with a Q&A where we have a bunch of questions that came in already, a bunch of fantastic questions that I think we see on a somewhat regular basis. So I already see there's a question that got dropped in the chat. As you have more questions, toss them in there throughout, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. Cool. So let's hop on into the content. So as we're talking about, thinking about financial aid, I think this is somewhere where we typically want to start. The college conversation, early on in the college conversation, talking through financial aid and how this impacts college decisions, whether it be, the decision on selecting where to go when you're looking at different options, or if you already have, the college in mind and you're figuring out, hey, how am I going to pay for it? Where loans come in, where out-of-pocket funding comes in, things like that. So when it comes to financial aid, I think it's important to keep in mind that not all financial aid is created equal. And some of it's going to be free. If you think about it, like grants or grants would be, something would be free. Some of it's going to be, earned, like looking at, work study would be an aspect of financial aid in which you actually have to work in order to get that component. And then some of it has to be paid back. And, sometimes people don't think of student loans as a component of financial aid, but there are specific types of student loans that have, advantages related to interest rates or benefits or things like that. that are connected to the financial aid process. So that's typically kind of where we start. So one of the common sources of financial aid that we kind of go through would be a grant. And a grant would be, a type of, let's call it free money. Generally speaking, we're looking at it a grant perspective that's going to address some aspect of financial need, which is, we'll kind of dive into that a little bit more later. So there's going to be different types of grants out there, depending on resources and, the state of residence or even the institution that you're talking about. So the Pell Grant would be a very, very common one that a lot of people hear about. There's also the Federal Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant. There can be state grants that's going to vary from state to state. So I think that's where it's really important, especially as you kind of go through this process, exploring what options are available in your specific state and, understanding what happens there based on need. And then you're going to have institutional grants. So an example there, I attended Valparaiso University in Northwest Indiana. So there would be a grant specific to Valparaiso University as a part of the financial aid package that I received. Next up would be scholarships. And scholarships, I think, is an area where we get a bunch of questions on, maximizing scholarships, things like that. At a high level, scholarships are going to be made up of different sources. Some of them are going to have national scholarships, state, local, civic, institutional. I think of it like institutional would be associated with, the college, for example, that you're looking at. Civic would be, let's say like a Rotary Club or a Booster Club or whatever that may be. Typically, these are going to have an application process. Some may take a good amount of work. Some may, take a little bit less work. But it's another component of free money. Work study is the third type of financial aid that we interact with. And, really that's going to be part of the financial aid package based on need. And it's associated with an on-campus job that would actually be paid to the student. It doesn't directly kind of deduct from tuition or room and board or anything like that. It's actually, the student is going to ultimately kind of get that paycheck. Good news is it's at least going to be the state minimum wage. So that's going to vary from state to state. But it's essentially, in order to take full advantage of a financial aid package, if work study is a portion of that, then it's important to have that conversation if you're a parent, with your child, to talk through what that actually means and what the benefit of taking on that responsibility is in conjunction with all their other responsibilities in college. And then finally, the last component or last type of financial aid would be student loans. Typically what we see here is, direct subsidized or unsubsidized loans, as well as plus loans, whether it be on the parent or not. So at a high level, we talk about, we kind of start talking about saying, okay, here's the different types of financial aid that's out there to kind of set context here. And the next logical question I think that a lot of people have is, how does it determine what type of financial aid that is actually going to be available for, my son or daughter as they go off to college? And, really financial need is going to be the component driving a lot of the financial aid, especially the need-based financial aid, merit-based, aid. So let's say based on athletics or academics or whatever that may be, that's not driven by need, but a big component of financial aid is based on need. So financial need is going to be based on factors like your income, both on the parent and student side, assets, both parent and student size, family size, other kids in college, things like that. And what's really interesting about this period of time is you'll see two different terms really tossed around. If you're going on, you're Googling or you're reading articles or anything, talking about financial aid, financial need, FAFSA. And those two terms would be the student aid index and the expected family contribution. And basically what happened is earlier in the year, it's still 2021. So earlier in the year, the FAFSA Simplification Act was passed, and it goes into effect in the 2023-2024 academic year. So that's where the student aid index comes from. And essentially the student aid index is the number that colleges use to determine the amount of financial aid. And how they determine that is going to be based on inputs from the FAFSA, such as the parental income, parental assets, student assets, family size, et cetera. And essentially how it kind of plays into the overall financial aid package is with the student aid index, you start with the cost of attendance for a particular university. And I'll use Valparaiso University as an example because I went there, and I can pick on that as opposed to some random school. So the cost of attendance for Valparaiso University would consist of tuition, fees, books and supplies, room and board, transportation, miscellaneous stuff. So you have that cost of attendance, and then essentially you subtract the student aid index, and then you get the overall financial need. So that's one term to keep in mind as you're talking about this financial aid experience, and we'll hit on the FAFSA and how that impacts it, because the inputs are based on the FAFSA. On the other side of things, expected family contribution, or EFC, is probably an acronym that families are well aware of. They see left and right as they're going through the experience, and they're like, what the heck is EFC? And essentially the EFC, or expected family contribution, that's going to represent the amount that a family would be expected to pay for college in a given year. That's going to impact need-based financial aid. And again, it's going to be determined based on FAFSA inputs that we talked about related to income, assets, family size, other kids in college, et cetera. So essentially, that FAFSA Simplification Act is more or less transitioning from expected family contribution to the student aid index. I guess what happened is critics of the EFC argued that it didn't do a great job in reflecting the full need related to attending college, and it resulted in putting some undue pressure on families. So as you kind of begin this process, don't be surprised if you see these two terms used interchangeably. The difference between EFC and student aid index, both are related to financial need. Both are driven from inputs that are going to be put in the FAFSA, in which we're going to dive into next. So transitioning to the FAFSA, because at the end of the day, the FAFSA is going to be the first step in the financial aid process. And I think there's some important high-level considerations when you're talking about the FAFSA. Number one being that it's free. And I put it in all caps. And if I could have, maybe I should have changed the font to size 50 and made it bright red. But the fact that it's free, I stress that because you'll see websites or programs or services out there that are paid services that market themselves associated with the FAFSA. Generally speaking, the FAFSA is free, and you shouldn't pay to complete the FAFSA. So that's important to keep in mind. The FAFSA for the 2022-2023 academic year, so that would be next school year, that had opened on October 1st. So gosh, just over or right about a week ago. So the FAFSA is officially open. So all of you parents that this is relevant for, or students that this is relevant for that academic year, hop on in there and you can start filling out the FAFSA. It starts on October 1st. We'll talk about some other deadlines later. Generally speaking, you're going to want to do it early. There's going to be, specific college, state, and federal deadlines that are out there. For example, the federal deadline for the FAFSA would be June 30th. And then the state deadlines are going to vary from state to state. So, for example, I live in the state of Michigan, and the deadline here is May 1st. So that can vary depending on the state, and then institutions, so specific colleges will have different deadlines too. Moral of the story is it's important not to wait, especially waiting past the beginning of the year, because we tend to see that being a little bit of a challenge, because after the first of the year, you got taxes coming up, you got New Year planning, you got all these other things going around, and things just kind of get chaotic and you forget about it. So generally speaking, as we're working with parents, it's hey, let's try to fill this out, before Thanksgiving, or maybe even between Thanksgiving and Christmas or the holidays, depending on what you got going on, to get it done early rather than waiting to the absolute deadline. When it comes to the FAFSA, I mentioned it's the first step in that financial aid process, and really, it's kind of, you could view this as it's a snapshot in time of your income, assets, and your overall family situation. And it's going to be used for most federal and state aid. each year or each version is going to cover one academic year. So the FAFSA right now that came out on October 1st is covering the academic year for 2022 to 2023. So need to do that for that next academic year. And then let's just use the example of, your son or daughter is going to be a freshman in college during that academic year. Then the next year, the next October 1st, the FAFSA would open up, and that version would be for the 2023, 2024 year. The good news is the first year is typically going to be the most time-consuming and challenging version to complete. Otherwise, a lot of the information can carry forward, and it can be much, much easier and time effective to complete the subsequent times that you're going through there and updating it. When it comes to the FAFSA, it's, there's going to be different ways that you can complete the FAFSA. Regardless of which way you complete the FAFSA, there's going to be similar components, or the same components actually, that you need to fill in. You're going to have, aspects related to logging in and setting up the overall, profile and credentials. You're going to fill out information related to the student demographics, information related to schools, dependency status. We'll touch on all these, and we're going to dive into these, parent demographics, and financial information. When it comes to filling out the FAFSA, you can use, the good old fashioned like PDF, paper version if you wanted to. You could use an online version that's done on a desktop, or you could use an app. Actually, the app-based experience, when I first saw that, I was really, really surprised. The app-based experience, you could do the whole thing from your phone, which is pretty cool. There are certainly going to be advantages that we'll touch on to doing an online or an app-based experience. But either way, they're going to have the same components that we'll dive into throughout the rest of the prepared talking points. Typically one of the questions we get as we start talking about FAFSA is like, hey, how in the world do I actually get started? And I think that, a couple things that we talk through is, number one, like organization and getting things ready would be a way to get started. And then number two, knowing where to turn to for help is another important aspect of getting started. So getting things organized, documentation, stuff like that. Generally speaking, you'll want to have, and this applies to both parent and student in the situation in which the student's dependent on the parent. You'd want to have information for both of them. You'd want to have like social security number, driver's license number, if that's applicable, tax information, any records or documentation for untaxed income, like maybe, child support, interest income, things like that. You'd also want to have like information for your assets related to like maybe cash or checking or savings, investments, stocks, bonds, things like that. So I think that's a good place to get started, is kind of getting organized and making sure that you have that information that ultimately you're going to need as you're filling out the FAFSA. Also thinking about where you could turn to help. I think that's also, important to keep in mind as you get started, because, sometimes you may get hung up on stuff, or may have questions, or like I mentioned earlier, there's always going to be complex or kind of corner cases that make things, more challenging as you go through this process. Number one, if you use the online or the mobile experience, the tooltips are really solid. Kind of going through that, you click on the little like info bubbles or whatever, and those tooltips are very, very informative as you go through the process, much more informative than other experiences that I've gone through. They also have a help page online. It's called FAFSA Help through the online experience. You can contact FAFSA through email, or I believe they also have like chat functionality. And then finally, you could also contact the financial aid office for the school or schools that are applicable to you. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of these 6 components and talk through some of the key things on not only what to be aware of, some helpful tips and things like that. So first, let's start off with the login aspect of it. Now, on the surface, logging in, considering that everything nowadays seems to be online, logging in is like, oh, Brian, like, why were we even talking about this? This is just a no-brainer. Well, the reason I bring this up is because we do get questions or comments or concerns related to the FSA IDs. So essentially, like if you think about early on in the process, one of the first things is going to be, creating an FSA ID. That's going to consist of, username, password. And the key thing to remember here is the student and the parent are each going to create their own. And these are going to be used each year for the FAFSA. So I mentioned earlier, there's each version applies to an academic year. So if you think about freshmen coming into this, even if that's your only kid, you're going to be using this at least for the next 4 years. So make sure you keep the FSA ID, keep that information handy for both the parent and the student. Another thing that comes up is, the parent and the student have separate FSA IDs. The parent can actually use the same FSA ID with multiple children, even though each child will need their own. So let's say, using my own family situation example, like, I don't know, 14 years from now, when my kids are old enough to go to school. So I would need, an FSA ID that I would use. And then when it's time to fill out the FAFSA for my son, Michael, he would have an FSA ID. And I would use my ID when I'm using Michael's ID for the FAFSA for related to him. My daughter Grace, a couple years later, when she goes to college, she would have her own FSA ID. I would still use my same FSA ID. So generally, it's a good idea to use a personal email address, keep your login information private, confidential, and then just basic best practices related to like passwords and I guess generally avoiding using like password 123, even though that could be tempting from time to time. So that's a key aspect that we tend to dive into when it comes to logging in is kind of going through that FSA ID process, because sometimes that can lead to questions and concerns. Next up, as we talk about student demographics, generally speaking, this tends to be one of the components that gets, at least from our end of things, gets probably some of the fewest amounts of questions related to it. So as you start filling out the FAFSA, the student demographic aspect is where you would enter in basic information for the student, like name, address, social security number, date of birth, driver's license number, email address, citizenship, marital status, gender, stuff like that. So it's important to get all that information correct when you fill it in, so that way there's not any issues or errors on the back end. So I guess it's one of those things to, like the old saying is, you measure twice and you cut once. So making sure as you're going through that process to enter that information appropriately. That tends to be, I guess, if I've seen questions from that personally for this section, it tended to be information entered in incorrectly. School selection is going to be a next component of the FAFSA as you're kind of going through this process. So as you're going through the FAFSA and you're completing the form, you have to list at least one school that's going to receive your information. And essentially, the school or schools that you list on the FAFSA will use that information to determine the types and amounts of financial aid that you may receive. So as you're going through this online experience, there's a federal school code search where you can find the colleges that you're interested in and you're considering, and you can include them on the FAFSA form. So generally speaking, if you're thinking about it from like a federal student aid perspective, the order of the schools. So like, let's say, I don't know, I'll use Valparaiso and Notre Dame because Notre Dame is my favorite football team. So like the order of that doesn't matter. For federal aid purposes, if I put Valpo first, Notre Dame second, or I put Notre Dame first and Valpo second, for federal aid purposes, doesn't matter. However, for state aid, some states will actually require you to list schools in particular order. So like, let's say, for example, you may need to list like a state school first. So again, that'll be something that's more state specific for you to ask questions about. Use the help functionality if you have questions, and whether or not you need to do that. You can list up to 10 schools as you're filling this out. I'm assuming you're doing it online or the mobile app. I think the PDF, I want to say 4. But again, I'm assuming most people do it online or the mobile app. You can list up to 10. And then one question we get is like the schools or parents are like, hey, can these schools see what other schools I'm considering or we're interested in based on the FAFSA? And the answer is no. Each school can't see the other schools that are on the list. So that's one thing to keep in mind as you're kind of going through this process. The next component as we're kind of going through the FAFSA process is related to dependency status. This is something where there's as you're going through and you're answering these questions, there's going to be a series of questions that are yes, no questions that ultimately are going to be used to determine whether or not the student is dependent or independent for the purposes of applying and having federal student aid. So if going through those questions, if it's like, hey, student is a dependent, then you're going to have to report parent information in addition to your own information. If the student is independent and the student is married, then also would have to include spousal information. So really that kind of drives the dependency questions, and all those questions really kind of drive, is the student dependent and need parent information? Are they independent? Okay, then just student information and possibly spouse if the student is married. From a demographic perspective on the parents, so assuming that the dependency status is like, hey, the student is a dependent, then that's where the parent demographics would come into play. A lot of aspects of this would be related to or similar to like the student demographics, so like basic information like name, address, social, driver, yada, yada. One aspect that we do tend to get questions and may ultimately kind of confuse people, and rightfully so, is like what's considered a parent, or which parent do we use? Because there's going to be situations where, of divorce, for example. So when you think about like what's a parent, so that would be a legal parent under, from a FAFSA perspective. So that would be biological parent, adoptive parent, or even like a person the state has determined is going to be the student's parent. The other aspect related to divorce, I know there are some questions on that, and I'm assuming we'll get to that in the Q&A. So if parents are divorced, then the student would list the parent that they lived with the most during the last 12 months, or if it's equal, the parent who provided the most financial support. And if that divorced parent is remarried, then you would list both the parent and the step parent. So we'll answer questions on that later, but that's one key thing to keep in mind, because we do see that a lot is divorced. Then it's number one, like first kind of threshold or gating factor would be, hey, which parent did we live with the most during the last 12 months? If that's equal, then it looks at, okay, which parent provided the most financial support during that period of time. And then if the divorced parents were married, then you list the parent and the step parent. Awesome. So probably the area that we see a ton of questions, not surprisingly, as financial planners, is the financial information section of the FAFSA. Honestly, there's several years back, the FAFSA experience, I feel bad saying this because some parents may not enjoy going through this experience, but it actually got much easier several years back when they shifted to using I guess what's known as prior tax information. So what it used to be is you would put in estimates and then you waited until you filed your taxes and then you updated things. Now that's not what happens. So when you're putting in financial information related to taxes, for example, for the 2022-2023 academic year, it would go based on the 2020 taxes. So that's where it got the name like prior approach. Also, another drastic improvement that makes this process much easier for people to go through is there is what's called the IRS data retrieval tool. So completely voluntary for you to use this. But I guess I would strongly encourage it because essentially it's an integration where ultimately it's going to reduce the amount of documents that we requested. It's going to speed up the overall awards process. And, honestly, it's going to reduce data entry errors because the information is going to get sent from the IRS directly to FAFSA. So it just saves a lot of time, a lot of mistakes, and it just makes the process much easier. If you don't use that IRS data retrieval tool, then you would ultimately enter in key pieces of information that you would kind of take from your tax return, and then match that up, and enter it in sections of the FAFSA in the places that are applicable. There's some really helpful tool tips. Again, going back to these tool tips, I sound like I'm just a complete fan of the FAFSA now, but there are some really helpful tool tips that help you kind of match up if you are going to do that manual process of like, okay, you click on the icon, it says, okay, line number, 42 or whatever, from your 1099 or whatever it may be. So it has, those tool tips. Beyond just like the mechanics of saying, hey, the IRS data retrieval tool typically makes that process much easier to pull in that, or to get that data sent over, and using the prior tax information. Another area that we come across is, okay, we're going to have to provide information related to assets and income. What information do we need? Like, what's included, what's not included? How does income and assets impact financial needs? So that's what we'll talk about next. So from an asset perspective, so assets going to be things that you own. Assets that would be included when it comes to the FAFSA would be cash and cash equivalents. So think of like physical cash, or like checking and savings accounts, CDs, money market accounts, stuff like that. Investments. So think of like a brokerage account, or, things like that. Real estate that is not a primary residence or a primary home. A covered account, or a 529 savings plan. The 529 savings plan is considered as a parental asset and not a student asset, which I'll touch on why that matters in a minute. Assets that aren't included when it comes to the FAFSA: primary residence, life insurance, retirement plans. Let's say if you have a family farm, or if you have a small business with less than 100 employees, those would not be included in the FAFSA. So a common example that I typically kind of come across is like an investment account. A lot of people look at an investment account as all things created equal. So let's say if you had an active invest account at SoFi, for example, that was a brokerage account or an after-tax account, and you had a 401k with your employer, that SoFi active invest account, that's a brokerage account, that's included. 401k not. So earlier I mentioned that there's a difference between, because you're going to input both, assuming the student's a dependent, you're going to input both parent assets and student assets. There is a difference in how parent assets and student assets are treated. So for student assets, so any included assets of the student would apply at a 20% ratio for financial need purposes. Any included assets for the parent would be at 5.64%. So earlier I mentioned a 529 savings plan. That would be considered a parental asset. That would be considered at 5.64%. As opposed to, let's say, if the student just had a checking account, you gave the student the same amount of money, it's just sitting in a checking account, that counts as 20%. So generally speaking, like a college savings plan has advantages as you're growing money, it's gross tax deferred, you take it out tax-free, assuming it's for qualified educational expenses, but also from a financial aid perspective, it counts as a parental asset, which is factored in a lower percentage than a student asset. Let's shift gears and we'll talk similarly to income. What's included, what's not included, and how does it differ based on the parent and student. So income that would be included in the FAFSA would be like income from work. I guess work study would be the exception if you're talking about student income. Any proceeds from asset sales. So let's say, I don't know, you made a bunch of money on a stock, you sold it, you're going to have a gain in it. Withdrawals from a retirement account, untaxed income, like retirement plan contributions would also be included. So let's say 401k contributions, stuff like that. And then any child support or alimony. Income that's not included in the FAFSA would be, examples of that would be like grants, scholarships, withdrawals from a 529 plan. I think there's a question about that. As far as 529 plan help or hurt, withdrawals from a 529 plan not counted as income, and then loan proceeds. So just like assets, income is treated differently for the parent versus the student. It's honestly, it's a little bit more complicated because for income, you also have income protection allowances. So we'll start with the student first. So a student income has kind of a 50% as far as applied towards determining financial need. But with a student, you have an income protection allowance of, for the 2021-2022 school year, it was $6,970. So that means, like, I don't know, let's say my son Michael, he's going to college, he's old enough, and he works over the summer and he makes $5,000. That's below the income protection allowance, so wouldn't impact financial aid. Let's say I don't know what kind of job it's going to be paying more than that for a high school kid in the summer, but let's say he makes like 20 grand. Then the 20 grand less the 6,970, whatever that difference is, what's it, like $13,030, that would apply the 50% threshold as far as towards financial aid. Parent income, that's going to range. It's not the 50% for parent income. It's going to range from 22 to 47%. And then the income protection for the parent income is going to be adjustable, I guess is probably the easiest way to put it. It's based on family size, number in college, stuff like that. So it's not going to be the same for every single person out there. It's not as simple or straightforward as the student. So that's why behind the scenes, there's a little bit more that goes in to the income piece than I guess that goes into the asset piece. So, I mean, generally speaking, we will get questions like, hey, like a lot of the questions we get related to income is like, oh, hey, should my kid work, or is that going to mess up their financial aid? That's where the income protection allowance comes into play big time. And, typically that ends up eating all, if not most of like income from like a summer job or a part-time job or anything like that. Perfect. So now we got some time left for questions, and we'll kind of go through these. Trying to move my mouse, sorry. So I'll take the first question. Does having money in a 529 plan help or hurt regarding FAFSA? So I guess, like, at a high level, like, overall, having money in a 529 savings plan is helpful because it's saved money to use for college. And it's considered as a parental asset, and withdrawals from a 529 savings plan aren't considered as income when it comes to the FAFSA. So those are all very, very positive things when it comes to a 529 plan. Now, that being said, like, if you had no money versus having a lot of money, having no money is technically better for financial aid purposes. So that would be one thing but generally speaking, 529 savings plans are advantageous across the board, not just saving, but withdrawals and from a financial aid perspective. There's some questions related to retirement plan assets and how those come into play with the FAFSA. Retirement plan assets are not included related to the FAFSA. There's another follow-up question on the 529 savings plan. When you withdraw money from a 529 savings plan, isn't it taxed? No, assuming it's for qualified educational expenses. So with a 529 savings plan, and I'll take a step back here. So 529 savings plan, there's two different types of 529 savings plans. So there's going to be a prepaid tuition plan, and then there's going to be truly like a 529 savings plan. With those, you put money in there. Some states offer a state income tax deduction, some states don't. That money grows tax deferred. If you take it out and it's for qualified educational expenses, so tuition, fees, room, board, miscellaneous type stuff, things like that. There's a huge list of things, of expenses that qualify if you go to whatever 529 plan you're using in the state associated with that. There's a huge list on there. As long as you use it for that, then you don't pay taxes on the withdrawals from a 529 savings plan. Next question, what's the best course of action for divorced parents when the non-custodial parent has less assets? So I guess number one, if there's any special circumstances, this is where I go back to reaching out to help. You could email, you could chat, you could talk to the financial aid office, things like that. But generally speaking, how the rules work related to divorce. So if if your parents are divorced or they're separated and they don't live together, then you would answer the questions and use the parent information with the one that you lived with most during the last 12 months, or if it's equal, the parent who provided the most financial support during that 12-month period. So that's going to be, that's the rules based on that. So the living with and the financial or in the providing financial support, that doesn't, and that may connect to financial assets or financial resources, but it may not connect to that. So that's generally speaking, that's how the rule is written related to FAFSA. Again, I think if it gets more complex to that, where there's a really big drastic difference, or there's divorce agreements and stuff like that, that's where it's worth reaching out to the financial aid office or reaching out to FAFSA help and things like that. Next question. What should a parent's income be to get a maximum FAFSA award? There's a couple different questions in a similar vein. Okay, so income and FAFSA, and I think this is like a common question that I see come across. I did a live stream on this topic, and we saw this question come up just in a brief like chat type of experience. I think this is probably one of the biggest myths that I see definitely in financial aid and college planning, but maybe even across all of personal finance, is like, hey, if I make too much money, then I can't submit the FAFSA, if I shouldn't submit the FAFSA, or whatever that may be. At the end of the day, I think everyone, regardless of income or things like that, should submit the FAFSA every single year, because that information that's going to be submitted to the FAFSA, it can qualify students for non-federal grants. So that could be from the state, it could be from private institutions, it could be from the college themselves. And some of those might be available to students that come from families from higher means or more means. Also, if you think about on top of that, there's even going to be some merit-based scholarships that are going to be offered by college or universities that they'll actually require you to file the FAFSA in order for that to be executed. So generally speaking, college planning experts who are way smarter than me, they say, hey, fill out the FAFSA. Even if you don't qualify for any sort of grants, scholarships, or anything like that, filling out the FAFSA, you're automatically going to qualify for federal student loans. So that could be an opportunity where it's like, hey, maybe plan A is to pay out of pocket because I have the resources to do it. Something can happen. And then if you need to take out a loan for it, it's like, oh crap, if I didn't do the FAFSA, then I got to do the FAFSA and take up a loan. It just makes it a bigger pain in the butt from a process perspective. Okay. Next question. There's a question. Okay. Question about the timing for a taxable event. So like, let's say an asset sale and there's like a large capital gain or something like that. So yeah, at a high level, so like, let's say you sell an investment or you sell an asset or something like that, and you experience a gain. Taxable income does impact the FAFSA. So I guess if there's a huge gain, that could certainly impact the FAFSA. Generally speaking, though, FAFSA and financial need and financial aid and stuff like that is one component. It's an important component, but it's just one component of thinking through like, hey, what's the overall strategy here? Generally speaking, we don't want people to avoid, selling something just for financial aid purposes. We need to consider like your overall asset allocation, your investment strategy, overall tax strategy, and then also financial aid in the mix too. So like, it depends on what the asset would be. Like if you're super concentrated in, let's say, company stock, the diversification benefits may outweigh, but that's gonna be a case-by-case situation. Next question, is a Roth IRA considered an asset that is a retirement account? So that would not be included from an asset perspective. Next question, is there a difference in the FAFSA application for current college students versus high school students? I think this goes back to the dependent versus independent. So I guess if you're a dependent student, then you're going to report yours and your parents' information. If you're an independent student, then you report your own information and then your spouse's if you're married. And generally speaking, that's going to be similar no matter, I guess, what the age is. So I think what we see the biggest differences would be, people who may, later on, like later in their career, they go to college and they're independent versus maybe, they're a high school student and they're a dependent. There's a handful of questions that are kind of similar to this one. So I'll pick this wording. Sorry if I didn't choose the wording of the way you asked it, but what are the keys to getting the most help and how can I tell if I've done everything and my FAFSA is correct? So I think the first area, kind of keys to getting the most help, I first and foremost fill out the FAFSA. If I could repeat that, like if you get nothing else out of today, then fill out the FAFSA. Another thing, I talked about the IRS data retrieval tool earlier. That's a really, really good way, honestly, to reduce the possibility for errors. I didn't have that luxury back when I did the FAFSA back in the day, when I filled it out for myself and for my parents. So that's a way to reduce it. I think from there, I think it's exploring different grants, scholarships, work study opportunities, even through the college selection process. I think an important aspect is to consider the net price of a college and the return on education that you're going to get, not just the sticker price. So I think it's considering like comparing the options and saying, hey, the sticker price may be X, but really after financial aid, it's going to be Y. And here's the graduation rate. Here's the expected earnings based on my major at this institution, and figuring out like, hey, what's the highest ROI? That's going to be a really helpful place to start and going through the process for college selection above and beyond financial aid. Okay, next question. There's services that coach you in parentheses on how to fill up the FAFSA and offer you for scholarships and all that stuff. Are they worth the money? On the FAFSA side of things, I say no. I stress like the FAFSA is free to fill out. So do I see an advantage to paying someone to fill out the FAFSA? I would probably say no. On the scholarship side of things, I think that's everyone has to kind of weigh the pros and cons for paid services for scholarships and things like that. I think I'm not going to endorse or recommend any of those or even the concept of it. Do your homework and make sure you get what you're paying for. And it may save you time, which may be worth it. Everyone kind of prioritizes things a little bit differently. Next question. How do schools look at things when you have two students attending different universities at the same time? I'm assuming I'm going to have that same situation in 14 or so years. Yeah, so technically that would impact financial need, behind the scenes, because both family size and the number of students that are attending college are considerations when determining financial need based on the FAFSA inputs. So like in theory, like you could have two people that make exactly the same amount of money, have exactly the same amount of assets, and one has two kids in college at the same time, the other one just has one kid period and one kid in college. Then the financial need of the family theoretically with two people in college would be higher, and that is considered in the calculations. Next question. When does expected family contributions switch to the student financial index? So the student aid index, it is the 2023, I believe. Let me pull up my notes. There's so many years that get merged together. Yeah, the student aid index is the 2023-2024 academic year. And also for those of you who are going to be going through this process for, for a handful of years, as another part of the FAFSA Simplification Act, the overall experience is supposed to get much simpler over the course of the next few years. So that'd be pretty cool. I mean, it'd be awesome if you didn't even need webinars like this or tooltips or anything like that to fill out the FAFSA. That'd be pretty sweet. Next question. If you are fairly sure you're not going to get any financial aid, why would you do the FAFSA and share all of your personal information? There's a handful of questions that were, I guess, similar to this. So I think I would kind of go back to, what we talked about earlier related to, it can, number one, impact student loans. Number two, it can impact, even merit-based scholarship from specific institutions where it may be a requirement. So I think I would kind of go back to that. And that's generally speaking why we encourage everyone to fill out the FAFSA. Next question. There's a question about parents' outstanding student loan debts impacting the calculation for financial need. So yeah, generally speaking, it's just looking at income and assets. So it doesn't look at the liability side of the balance sheet, assuming you're done with education and things like that. So like, let's say, I don't know, perfect example would be, I guess I'm a bad example because I'm currently working on my PhD, but like, let's say I'm done with college and I just have student loans that I'm still paying off, then it's not going to consider it from a liability perspective, even though I completely, I understand, I'm thinking about it from like more of a human perspective. And I completely understand that repaying your own student loans while trying to pay and help your kids out with college is a pretty big financial burden. But no, just the calculations, income, assets. That could also be something I missed talking about this. I briefly mentioned special considerations. So at the end of the day, like when you think about the FAFSA, it's templated. Like it is, you input information, it goes through, and the great thing is it's a consistent formula. So it's fair across the board with the same information. At the same time, there are special circumstances. So you can submit information and file special circumstances. You could even, after you get a financial aid award letter from a university or a college, you can submit documentation based on their process for special circumstances. So let's say it's a child with special needs. Let's say you lost a job. Let's say you have a crazy undue burden because of student loans that you're paying back or things like that. So I think if you feel like there's extenuating circumstances, you should explore the special circumstances route and see if that's going to be a possibility, because there are going to be issues along the way. Next question, speaking of owned student loans, what advice do you have for me paying down my student loans or getting the best consolidation program I have for both my federal and my private student loans? So yeah, great question. So I think it's important to kind of separate federal student loans from private student loans. Like at high level, there's two main types of student loans. So federal student loans come with federal benefits, private student loans don't. You can consolidate federal student loans through a direct loan consolidation. You keep your federal benefits. You basically merge a bunch of federal loan payments into one payment. You don't lower your interest rate. You can stretch out your term, but you don't lower your rate. You keep your federal benefits. That's consolidation. That's different than refinancing. Refinancing your student loans is when you actually take out a new loan with a private lender, and then it pays off. It could be federal loans, it could be private loans, it could be a mixed match of the two. You lose your federal benefits. Ideally, you lower your interest rate. So there's pros and cons here. Private student loans, I think if you have those and you could lower your rate, you could save money. Typically, it's probably going to be advantageous to explore that. Federal student loans, you really need to weigh the federal benefits. For example, payments on federal student loans are suspended and the interest is suspended through January 31st of 2022. That started way back in the beginning of COVID. So yeah, that would be something to consider before you refinance. Make sure you weigh the pros and cons of those federal benefits and what you get out of it. Next question, what AGI qualifies me to receive financial aid? We submit our info and did not receive any financial aid in 2021. So there's no hard and fast rule or limit, like saying, hey, if you make above this much, then you can't do the FAFSA or anything like that. Some aid's going to be based on financial needs. Some's going to be based on merit. And, I think at high level, I go back to the loan side of things, like unsubsidized federal loans is an important component related to financial aid packages, and that doesn't necessarily connect to AGI or need. Okay, next question. I think we got time for like one or two more. I'm just looking to see if we have like a common theme. Okay, next question. Yeah, this is one that we see come up on a regular basis. If I spend all of my child's 529 plan during their freshman years, 529 need to be included on the sophomore year FAFSA. Yeah, going back to the when I was talking through the FAFSA, this is where I mentioned it's a snapshot. I think keeping that in mind is extremely helpful. So like, let's say if you had $5,000 in your 529 plan, you take that out, you use it to help pay for freshman year, and now you have nothing left in the 529 plan. October 1st rolls around again, and you're like, hey, technically you don't have that 529 plan, so it wouldn't be counted as a parental asset because it wouldn't be an asset that you owned. So no, it wouldn't be included in that next version, assuming it was zero when you went through that process. Perfect. Well, number one, I appreciate everyone joining. I know we're at time here, and I know it's getting late in the evening. And I know there's some questions that we couldn't get through. I'm gonna see if we could answer these and kind of follow up or things like that. But if you do have any further questions about personal finances in general, or college planning, things like that, you can always schedule a complimentary call with the team that I lead of financial planners. All members have access to schedule a call for free. So you can go on the app, or you can go on the website, and you can kind of go in there and schedule an appointment, and you can go through that experience. Perfect. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of the evening and a great rest of the week.